Hello, and welcome to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm your host, Wade Borth, and in every episode, my goal is to get you to think differently about how money works and ultimately to empower you to take control of your money and your personal financing system. Before we got on for this podcast, I actually had a guy text me saying, hey, do you know anybody that's in the IBC world that is willing to do some, what do you call venture capitalists? He's looking to borrow money from IBC practitioners. People who are practicing IBC. So now he's coming with an offer saying, hey, I need some cash. Would you be willing to fund this? This is what's going to happen once your operation is up and running. And now who's the one that's in control, right? Now you're the banker. You're the one that's taking, I'm going to give him a toaster type of thing. And then what we're going to do, hopefully, is we'll take our money, we'll put it to work and make the type of returns that banks are making. Maybe not that much, because again, I think if we did what banks, the existing banking structure is doing today, we'd all go to jail. But the point is taking the same thought process that banks do, apply to what we do with our.
Yeah, and it all goes back to this chapter in the beginning of imagination, using your imagination and thinking outside the box about what possibilities are out there. So This guy knows that people have cash in policies and has an opportunity for those people to invest in whatever it is that he's got going. When I first learned about IBC, I was thinking about it in terms of only my own world and my own life, not about advertising, quote unquote, advertising that, hey, my bank is open and I can loan money to customers that I believe in.
Which could be your children for the things they're going to buy. This is not new to the world. The Rockefellers of this world have been doing this for a century. So it's not like it's a new idea. It's just that we haven't opened our mind up enough to hear that these words are out there, because again, we've been conditioned to think that the only place to get money is to go to the bank. And so you get somebody to supply them with money and then somebody to take that out. All we're talking about is controlling the supply chain. We're going to be our best customers to begin with because we're going to get our own restaurant, but eventually people will start buying from our supply chain as well. One of the things that I was going to bring up too is that with this guy, he actually owned the cattle ranch for about 10 years. So one of the things we talked about is that this idea that you and I are talking about doesn't happen overnight. It is a process. Really, it becomes a lifelong process because there's so many people that want immediate gratification. But if they truly understand what's going on here, is that this guy took 10 years to build his cattle ranch. Then he opened his restaurant and then he went and bought and this has been a 10-year process for this guy to get where he's at now. In Nelson's book, it took him 13 years to get away from the snakes and dragons, as he called it. And so understanding what the problem is, again, from this podcast, is that we have to focus on the right thing, get away from focusing on the small thing and focus on the big thing. And I was having a conversation with a real estate investor, and I asked him this question. I said, what's your biggest issues? He goes, money, right? Access to money. I said, well, tell me more about that. And it kind of came down to this, right? He kind of understands what his problem is. His problem is that he doesn't like to go to banks because of the process of getting money from the bank. He doesn't like the timing, because when he's ready to move, the banks are still dragging their feet, or they need 14 people to put a stamp of approval on his business. And he doesn't like the contracts he has to sign with the banks because they always favor the bank. And then how and when the money is paid back. That's a huge thing that was just driving him absolutely crazy. Because there's loans out there that doesn't allow him to pay it back early. Or these are the terms set by somebody. And so he understood the problem in his situation was this: with everybody else having the ability to veto this process anywhere along the way, he's never really in control of his business. Goes back to the restaurateur, the same thing. He understood that if anybody along the way, his supply chain, anywhere along the way was disrupted, he's not in control of his business. So that's the same issue that we're having.
Yep.
Then I talked to his colleague, this real estate investor I was talking about. And his real estate investor is probably the guy with all the money. He said, well, I use cash. We got a war chest that we use to finance everything we do. I'm like, okay, which is one step better than being indebted to the bank, right? So then I asked him, I said, well, when you use that war chest, when you use that money, what type of process do you have that you have to pay back that money? He looked at me like, what do you mean? I said, when you go to Wells Fargo, you go to any other bank, and you've heard me say this 1,000 times, and I got other podcasts that said you have to love yourself and your family more than you love Wells Fargo. But most people don't get that because they don't understand what that's part of their problem. So I said, what's your process? And he goes, we don't have a process. I said, well, you have to have a process, because if you don't, then the money, a lot of times, maybe doesn't get paid back. If you don't pay the money back, then how do you know it's a good deal for the real estate guy? I said, let's talk about the process. And then the other thing about the guy with cash, he says, I hate having cash sitting around because it has no value. I said, what do you mean it has no value? Right? This goes back to what Peter talked about. He goes, yeah, it has no value. I said, yeah, that's because you put value. The value you're putting on your cash is what the bank is putting on for an interest rate. That's how he judges value.
Yeah.
He doesn't see it as an external use of his money. I said, what if you could store your money like Wells Fargo stores their money? 20% or $20 billion of Wells Fargo money sits in properly structured life insurance policies, right? I said, what if you did part of what your money was and stored it in properly structured life insurance? So if you're not using it, it's doing better than sitting in cash or sitting at a 4% interest rate. Wouldn't that be a better solution? And so it really had him step back and think about the process and then the product that we're using. So again, it goes back to that whole thing. He understood what his problem was. He wanted a better solution. And then we talked about the process, and then we said, well, what's the best tool that the process that we're doing and solve that solution? Here is the solution to that problem.
It's interesting because this chapter about the problem is really talking a lot about the disparity between the interest that we're paying to other people and the fact that we're not in control of that. The disparity between the interest that we're paying, the interest that we're earning, the fact that we're not in control of that. But just listening to you and listening to the stories about the restaurateur and the cattle rancher and this real estate guy, it just takes it a little bit deeper in that the problem is truly that we don't understand how money works. We just don't understand. We are not taught that. It's not something that's just passed along in most families from generation to generation. And so we go into every decision that we're making financially with a skewed mindset.
Exactly. We have a preconceived paradigm that we go into these situations with. And so the biggest problem, quite frankly, we probably could have summed it up in 2 minutes, is that we have to change our paradigm. We have to change how we think the ultimate outcome has to be, or where our starting point is.
We think the world's flat, and in fact, we're going to sail off the end when in fact it's round, and we're just going to sail all the way around it.
Exactly. Until you have those big aha moments, and I've had them many times in my journey with IBC. I'm like you. I grew and progressed in my thought process many times. Hopefully that never stops, right? Yeah. How many times have you said, I just never thought of it that way, or I never thought about the different situations you and I talk about? How many times does that ever come up?
Yeah, not every time.
Yeah. And so part of it isn't just thinking that you have to discover this on your own. Quite frankly, what we're trying to do is build a community to think differently. We want people to surround themselves with like-minded individuals that say, I get this. I want to take control of the banking function of my life. And if I can find 2 or 3 of the people in my sphere of influence that want to change that, too, are willing to take some time to study Nelson's book, talk to a practitioner like you and I or Nicole, and really take control of that function in their lives, then we have a better community. Because then you have people who challenge your thought process and say, is this the way you think you should be doing it? It's not just us being the guides. Because again, I don't want to be that gatekeeper. I want to empower you to take control of that. Sometimes empowering you means empowering you and those around you to be able to take control of that banking function. I think Nelson said it in his book too. Everything you do in the financial world is compared to what everybody else is doing. So let me just say that again. Everything you do in the financial world is compared with what everybody else is doing. So compare yourself to people that want to get better versus people that don't, right? Identify the problem. Say, I want to move beyond that. I want to change my environment. And then surround yourself with those that want to do the same thing, that want to surround them, that want a better environment. Yeah. Stop focusing on the little stuff.
Yeah. And he writes down here at the very end, in the very last paragraph of this, somehow or another, it never dawns on most financial gurus that you can control the financial environment in which you operate.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in the very last sentence too, and that's a great paragraph too, he goes, learning to control that environment is the most profitable thing that you can do over a lifetime.
Yeah.
Learning to control it that environment is the most profitable thing you can do over a lifetime. It doesn't say in a year or 2 years or 5 years, over your lifetime.
Yeah,
it's huge. And it's probably the best way to leave it, because ultimately one of my founding principles is to make this multi-generational. I don't want to have my son be conditioned to think a certain way and then have to unlearn that at 35 years old like I had to do it. I want to start teaching him now so he has an understanding. And just even a partial understanding what we're talking about, because we never fully get there. I'm not fully there yet. I'm still learning, still progressing, hopefully. We'll get him so much ahead of everybody else that are his peers, because he's understanding at least parts of this as we go along. You're not going to be able to absorb all this in one sitting, in one conversation. This is a lifetime process. And it starts with our ability to want to change our paradigm. It starts with that process there, understanding what the problem is and wanting to change. And then, again, finding a practitioner like you or I to work with, and hopefully we can guide you along your way. We don't want to be that gatekeeper. We just want to guide you and empower you to take control of that environment. So I'll leave you with the last word. What do you have? Anything? I know I've done most of the talking here, and I get pretty worked up about this because it is so, to me, it's become so passionate because there's such an opportunity for people to take control and see what's going on and finding ways out of that financial bondage that we think that there's no solution to.
Yeah. I mentioned to you earlier before we started that there have been, for sure, over the course of the last 2 years, times where I've stepped away from this and gone, is this really what I think it is? And every time I come back and I read and dig in, I'm like, I just don't know how we missed this all of these years. I just don't know how we missed it. I don't know how, as a society, I do know, but it's just mind-boggling to me that we have a whole country, a whole world of people that don't understand this concept. And it's so simple, and yet it's not necessarily easy. The concept is so simple, and yet it takes time and it takes a lot of digging in to really go, oh, okay, I get it now.
You're right. It's simple because we try not to put up any barrier. I think a lot of people that want to be gatekeepers put up a lot of barriers so you see value in them opening the curtains for you. Where I want to make the barriers here are simple. Anybody can do this. Nelson actually said in this chapter, he said, you don't need to have millions of dollars to do this. You start where you can start, and then you progress from that point going forward. Thank you again. I know I was going to give you the last word, but it's my podcast.
You're in control of it, right? It's your podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Again, thank you for listening to the Wade Borth podcast. I'm looking forward to further chapters with Nicole. You've been great as we learn and go through the journey of IBC. This has been fabulous. So thank you again for your time, and looking forward to our next call.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. If you're enjoying this podcast or know anyone else that might be interested, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and please leave a review. This will help this podcast reach and help more people by ranking higher in searches, and ultimately help more people get out of financial bondage. And don't be afraid to share this podcast with your friends and family, as we can be easily found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.